we are making a no-knead fresh loaf of bread. Now, fair warning, this recipe takes a little while, not in terms of how much work you have to put in, but in terms of how much work the yeast has to put in. So it's not going to be done in one evening. This will take you at least 2 days. We're going to mix up some of our ingredients tonight. We're going to let them do kind of their thing and let the yeast develop a lot of gas and flavor. Then we're going to let it chill in the fridge overnight at least, and then continue tomorrow. So don't plan on eating your bread tonight. You will have really delicious bread though in the near future. So without further ado, let's hit up those ingredients. So ingredient number 1 is going to be bread flour. And you don't want to use all-purpose, you don't want to use cake flour. We want something with a high protein content. So we want bread flour. It makes a stronger bread, it gives us better structure, it holds on to the gases better. It gives us that chewiness that we really like in bread. You're going to need some salt. Going to need some active dry yeast, and then water. You want it to be barely lukewarm. It should barely feel like it's not cold. If you have an instant read thermometer, it should read about 80-ish degrees. And the volumes we need for these ingredients break down like this. You need about 3.5 cups or 525 grams of bread flour, 2 teaspoons or 12 grams of salt, 2¼ teaspoons or 7 grams of active dry yeast, and 2 2/3 cup or 395 grams warmish water. It shouldn't really even feel warm when you touch it. It should almost feel like it could maybe be cold. And I'm using all these strange descriptors because it's this strange temperature range where it's really easy to overshoot it and it's really easy to undershoot it. Now, as long as you don't use crazy hot water, you're not going to ruin your bread. The yeast is going to be fine. Some steps might just take a little bit longer for the yeast to really be active and do their thing. So I'm going to measure out all those ingredients and I'm going to show you what the processes look like after those are measured out. Okay, we have here our flour, salt, and yeast. And again, that's, and I'm going to, when it comes to baking, I'm definitely going to lean more on weights than I am on volumes. So that's 525 grams of bread flour or 3.5 cups, 12 grams of salt or 2 teaspoons, 2 1/4 teaspoons or 7 grams of active dry yeast, and then we're going to measure out our water once we've mixed all of our dry ingredients. So the first step here is simply, you need to use a really big bowl for mixing all of this so we have plenty of room for our dough to rise later, and we just combine all of our dry ingredients here. So all of your bread flour into the bowl, add your salt, make sure to get all of it, and your yeast. And you can grab a whisk for this or you can just use your hands. And just, we're trying to make sure there aren't any clumps of yeast or salt anywhere in this mixture. Okay, that is pretty good. Now I'm going to pull out my scale for this. Make sure you can see that. Turn it on, zero it out. And I've already got some water back here that I prepared that is just above 80 degrees. It's about 85 degrees using my handy dandy ThermoWorks instant read thermometer. These things are phenomenal. And so what I'm going to do here is simply pour in the 395 grams of water that I need, keeping an eye on the scale. So close. Okay, I'm over by 2 grams. That's totally fine. Not the end of the world at all. If at the end of this our dough is a little too wet, we can add a tiny bit of flour. If it's a little too dry, we can add a little bit more water. Now you don't want to go crazy with that, but it's not the end of the world to adjust your dough a little bit. There are environmental factors at play as well. You could be in a drier environment and the flour sitting in your cupboard is just drier because of that, and you might need to use a little bit more water. So we're using our hands for this. We're just going to mix all of this up. Squishing it tends to actually work surprisingly well. Do some squishes and some scoops with your hands. If you have a bowl scraper, that also works fairly well. We are simply aiming to get all of the flour mixed with all the water and not have any more dry spots. So we don't want any pockets of flour in here. And this doesn't take long. It's maybe 30 seconds or so of mixing, maybe up to a minute. We're not trying to knead the dough here. We're not aiming to build up gluten. We're simply trying to get all of the flour wet with that water and our yeast and our salt all mixed together. And there is your dough. You're going to get dough hands. That's totally fine. Some people say they have tricks to make sure it doesn't happen. I haven't found any of those that actually work yet. So if you have one that works, let me know. But other than that, just accepting that your hands get doughy. Now, okay, this next part's super easy. Literally all we're going to do is cover the bowl with either a large plate or some saran wrap, or you can even get some shower caps. We're going to cover this bowl and let it sit for 3 hours at room temperature. You should see that ball of dough you've got there basically double in size during that time. The reason we cover it is, well, actually there's a couple of reasons. First off, we want to trap any moisture in here that we've already imparted. We just put all that water in there and put in all the work. Got our hands all messy to add the water. We don't want to waste it. The other is drafts in your environment can cause the dough on top to harden and dry out, and that will keep it from being able to rise so that our yeast won't be able to actually do their job. So simply cover this, let it rest for 3 hours. Just set it somewhere aside in your kitchen. Ideally nowhere cold, but nowhere hot either, just roomish temp. And by the end of 3 hours, this should be doubled in size. I'll show you what that looks like. And when that's done, the next step is super simple. You let it double for about 3 hours, and then you throw this in the fridge for 1 to 7 days. Anywhere from 1 to 7 days. The longer you let this dough rest, the more flavor it will develop. But if you are looking to make it a little bit on the quicker side, let it sit in your fridge for 1 day, a minimum of 12 hours, so minimum of overnight. That's if you're really in a rush. Ideally, give it at least 24 hours before you take it out and do next steps. But you can give it all the way up to 7 full days developing flavor in your fridge after you let this double up in size. So I will be back in 3 hours to let you see or to show you what this looks like after it's doubled up a bit. As you can see, the dough has significantly expanded, doubled if not more so in size in the 3 hours it has been sitting here. Now you don't need to change anything for how this is set up right now. Leave it covered and place it in your fridge for a minimum of 1 day. If you really have to cut it short, you could probably push it 12 hours. But you can leave it in your fridge for anywhere from 1 day to an entire week. And during that time, the flavors will continue to develop and get richer. So in this recipe, the first time around, you're probably going to be a little excited and you want to try to get it done as fast as possible. So give it a day, give it 24 hours, bake it up, do the rest of the steps along with me coming up later in this video and see how delicious that tastes. And then make this recipe again and give it a whole week sitting in the fridge, developing flavor, and then bake that one up and notice just the mind-blowing difference in flavors that you get, because it is the proofing time of your dough where the flavors really get developed. And when you try to shorten that proofing time or shortchange it, you cut out a lot of those delicious flavors. So throw this in the fridge for a minimum of 1 day and up to a week before moving on to your next steps. Your bread should have been resting in the fridge for at least 24 hours at this point and up to a full 7 days, allowing it to cold proof and let those flavors really build up so you get beautiful, delicious bread at the end of this recipe. go ahead and grab your dough, bring it out of the fridge, set it on the counter. A few other things you're going to want to grab right now is the pan you'll be baking in, so a nice loaf pan, a little bit of flour so we can dust the surface we're about to work on, a little olive oil so we can oil our pan and we'll oil the top of our loaf before we cover it, and a little bit of aluminum foil that we're going to use to cover our pan as things proof a little bit longer on the counter and when it first goes into the oven. So go ahead and grab those things now. I have my loaf pan here. I'm just going to put a little bit of olive oil on the inside. I prefer olive oil over a non-stick cooking spray because non-stick cooking sprays have all sorts of chemicals that are terrible for you, and olive oil is fantastic for you. So when in doubt, skip the cooking sprays and use something like olive oil or even avocado oil instead. This is just a little extra insurance. Most bread pans these days actually come with a non-stick coatings. Even this one, although it doesn't look like it, technically has a non-stick coating to it. So oil that up. I'm just wiping the oil off my fingers now and set that aside. We're going to use that in a few minutes. Next up, we've got our dough. This has been sitting in the fridge for a minimum of 24 hours. Just want to show you what that looks like here. Let's zoom in a little bit and you can see all the texture going on with this dough. You should have a little bit of like a slightly sweet scent, not candy sweet, but there is a little bit of a yeasty sweetness to it right now. Set this aside just momentarily because we're going to take out some flour and dust our surface. Now, don't overthink this. It's not too crazy. Just take a little scoop of flour and you can throw it. So just throw it at your surface. You need to spread it around a little bit. Go ahead and do that. We're going to dust just a little bit of flour on top of our dough so that it's less likely to stick when we pull it out of here. And then we're going to plop that down in there, upside down from where it's at right now. Put a little bit of flour on top of that. Stretch it out to try to make a little bit more of a circle and even things out. Fold in our sides, then roll it up kind of like a burrito before we place it in our pan that we're going to bake it in. Cold dough is much less sticky than warm dough, so it should come out fairly easily. You don't need much flour on top, just a little bit on top and a little bit on your hands to make it a little easier to stretch out your dough. You're going for even-ish. It doesn't need to be perfect. Okay, so dough is stretched out. It should be a little bit sticky. It doesn't need to be perfectly even. As you can see, this isn't a perfect circle. That's really fine. You're going to take your right side, fold it in, left side, fold it in. You can overlap a little bit, or you can make them line up right in the center. I'm going to have mine overlap just a little bit. And then what we're going to do is pick up the end closest to you and start rolling it kind of like a little burrito. You want to tuck this fairly well. And you can roll and actually pull a little bit. And when you do that, that helps tuck it a little bit tighter. You can even see the ends on this looking a little wonky. If you want to hide that, just take your dough up top and stretch it out over a little bit. So here we have our burrito bread. That's what it looks like right now. And all you do is pick this up, and with the seam side down, so the seam is where it comes together, right there, right? Seam side down into your pan, just like so. And then we're going to put just the tiniest bit of oil on top of here. If you have a pastry brush, use that. It makes life a little bit easier to just brush it on top. So I'm going to use a little ramekin and a pastry brush, but you could also just pour a little olive oil on top and rub it on with your hands if you don't have a pastry brush. You could even use a piece of paper towel that you dip into your olive oil and pretend it's a pastry brush and use that. The reason we do this is partially to keep the aluminum foil we're about to put on top from sticking. Also, the fat on here is going to help with a little bit of browning in the oven later. So you don't need much, just a little bit. So we want to use enough aluminum foil that we give ourselves at least a 2-inch gap on top because we want this bread to rise more and we want to make sure that the foil doesn't trap it. So if you throw your foil down like this, you're not creating enough space for your bread to rise. It's going to get stuck against that foil later on when it rises, 1, because we're going to let it sit on the counter, and 2, because it's going to bake with the foil on top for the first half. So what you're going to want to do is kind of attach one side to your pan and then really arch it in the middle to make sure you have plenty of space for that dough to rise and catch your edges. And we do want a fairly tight seal here because this will be trapping steam later on to help our bread rise even more. So without a good seal, we don't trap enough steam. So get that nice and sealed up. Make sure you've got a nice big gap on top. And then set this aside somewhere in your kitchen, somewhere that's not cold, somewhere that's not hot, just room temperature space for 4 hours. This is going to be the final proofing of our bread. It's going to allow it to expand a bit more before it goes in the oven. It's going to allow it to develop some more flavors before it goes in the oven. And what you should do is set a timer for about, say, 3.5 hours. And then at 3.5 hours, start preheating your oven. And we're going to want to preheat our ovens to 475 degrees Fahrenheit. Bread bakes at pretty high temperatures. After that last 30 minutes, there should be plenty of time for your oven to preheat and for your bread to finish doing its final proof. We're then going to bake it with the aluminum foil on for 20 minutes. That's 20. Then we're going to take the cover off, the aluminum foil, bake it for another 20 minutes, and then we'll see how brown it is. If it doesn't look brown enough yet, you add 7 or 8 minutes. If it looks totally done, great, you're done. Take it out of the oven. We're going to let it rest for 1 hour because when you take your bread out of the oven, it's actually still baking. The heat on the inside is trapped and causing the inside to continue to bake. If you were to slice into it right away, you'd lose a ton of moisture and it would stop cooking. And so you would end up with a bread that on the outside looks done, but the inside is not yet complete. And that may have been something you've encountered either in something you've made before or something someone has served you where you thought, that's weird, the outside of the bread's all baked, but the inside's a little gummy or a little too chewy. So that's one of the things you run into. Make sure you let it rest long enough. So take this guy, set it aside for 4 hours, and I'm going to come back and show you what the next steps look like after that. It has been 4 hours and our bread has risen quite nicely. That air pocket you left on top, if you tap it, you'll actually feel the dough is up there. Now on yours, leave the top on, but I'm going to show you what it looks like with the foil off. Now you should have preheated your oven to 475 degrees by now. If not, do it right away. Here is a quick peek at how much that dough rose. And I got a little bit sticking, which wouldn't be a problem if I wasn't taking my foil off right now. You can see how much that dough expanded since when we first put it in there. So I'm just going to kind of tuck mine back in there real quick. And then this is going to go into my 475 degree oven for 20 minutes covered. And I actually tore my foil a little bit, so I'm going to put another piece of foil on top just to get a really good seal on the steam in here, because that's really what we want. We want lots of steam to get captured in this bread. So put this in your 475 degree oven, bake this for 20 minutes covered. After 20 minutes, take the cover off, bake it for another 20 minutes. If the top looks beautiful and golden brown, you're done. Take it out, pop it out of the pan and let it rest on a cooling rack for 1 hour. If, however, the top of your bread doesn't really look very golden brown, doesn't look a little dark brown, you can go pretty far with these things. You can go pretty dark. Give it another 5-8 minutes and watch the color change. You do want a bit of darkness showing up on top. Once you get some of that darkness going on, take it out and again, let it rest on a cooling rack, pop it out of the pan so that the outer edges don't keep baking. and let it cool for 1 hour before diving in. I'll let you see what mine looks like when it's all done so you get an idea of what color you should be expecting. Now go ahead and pop that into your preheated 475 degree oven. This just came out of our oven. You can see there's nice coloration on here. This is the minimum darkness I want you aiming for. You can go much darker than this. It's not burnt when it goes darker, simply richer. The darkness is actually more like a caramelization than it is burning. Now, with this loaf right now, it's still in our pan. We do need to pop it out, and it might be a little sticky since, if you look closely, a little bit of my dough, because I took the foil off earlier, came over the side. So if your bread sticks a little bit, I'll show you how to get it out. Actually, this might pop right out. You do want to remove it from the pan immediately. Careful though, the pan will still be quite hot. Set that aside. The loaf is also going to be a bit toasty. So let this cool on your pan for a minimum of 1 hour. The inside of this, you can feel how much heat is on there. The inside of this is still baking as we speak, even though it's not in the oven anymore. So let this finish baking by allowing it to cool for 1 hour. If you don't have a cooling rack, another thing you can do is you can simply use a dinner plate or even a baking pan, and all you need to do is elevate one side, still toasty, one side of your bread so that airflow can go underneath, and that just helps it to cool properly and not get soggy in any spaces. So again, let this cool for at least 60 minutes, and then you can dive right in. Eat up. It's fantastic as a sandwich bread. You can turn this into some French toast, put a little butter, salt, and jam on top of this. It'll be delightful. You can use it for your avocado toast. Basically, anything you would use regular bread with, you can use this, and it's going to taste phenomenal.